Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, everybody. Wow, this is a little bit. This is a great turnout. A little terrifying. No, seriously. I can talk about this stuff all day. We'll be fine. I want to start by thanking the library for inviting me. This is such a wonderful series. I saw the last talk with Sharon and her work on The Wire and stuff, and I'm excited to see Sandra's talk coming up. She's wonderful. And so I'm honored to be in that company. I also want to start at the very beginning, because if I don't do it at the beginning, I'll forget. I want to thank a couple of folks. I want to thank Jennifer Howie and Taj Maki, who are two people who I've done a lot of this research with. And I don't want to present to the world as though I did this all by myself. I think scholarship is best when it's a team sport. So I want to give those two a shout out. Okay, so when we booked this talk, it might have even been last spring, I thought, man, I wonder if anybody's even going to care about my dumb little research. And all of a sudden, world events have sort of conspired to make this a pretty salient topic right now. So I want to start off by talking about this article from the New York Times in 2010. The headline was, "American Muslims Ask, Will We Ever Belong?" And this is really a question that's at the center of a lot of my research and the research that I've done for the last 8 years. What we find is Muslims in Europe and throughout North America, they find themselves at the center of a perceived conflict between their religious identity and their national loyalty. And this plays out in media discourse a lot. And this is what my research focuses on, particularly the journalistic presentation of these conflicts. So the conflicts are happening. I'm interested in the journalism about it. So I'm going to give highlights from 3 research projects. And right at the outset, I want to say the common thread through these is looking at the socially constructed position of Muslims in the U.S., and especially the way media coverage constructs Muslims as perpetual outsiders, regardless of the ideology or activities of individual Muslims, okay? What I've found is that in our media discourse, very often Muslims are portrayed as an outgroup in comparison to so-called regular Americans or real Americans, or depending on your ideological point of view, real Americans. Sorry, it's a little joke. You got to start it with a joke somewhere in the beginning. There's another little particular piece to my research that I'm interested in, the moral language that we use to reinforce this outsider status for Muslims. So that was a 2010 article. This is something that's come up just recently. This research has more pressing relevance now in this era of extreme vetting and travel bans and ascendant nationalism throughout the West, which, I mean, let's be honest, is in itself in part a reaction to some horrific terrorist attacks that have sort of ruptured our sense of safety. And so as we see these executive orders that we're seeing and discussions of hashtag Muslim ban, these are things that a year ago may have been unfathomable to us. I think it's important to talk about these issues. So at their root, my research examines what kinds of physical and metaphorical space Muslims are allowed to occupy in U.S. society vis-a-vis media coverage. So I want to talk about some statistics. I want to lay some groundwork right here at the beginning. Muslims make up a pretty tiny part of the U.S. population. We don't ask religion on the census, so it's really hard to get a solid number. But the most reasonable estimates are somewhere between 1% and 3% of the U.S. population is Muslim. So it's reasonable to suggest that media portrayals are major contributors to public perceptions and attitudes about Muslims, particularly among people with no daily personal interactions. This is an important dynamic for researchers because, as sociologist Todd Gitlin tells us, audience members without direct experiences to draw upon become more vulnerable to media framing. Oh, media framing. I suppose I should talk about media framing for a second. I'm a media framing guy. This is one of the most popular theoretical frameworks in journalism and mass comm research. And it's concerned with how information is presented through the inclusion and omission of topics, sources, information, whatever. So it's easily understood. It's commonsensical. We use the word framing all the time. So the problem, though, is because it's commonsensical and we use the word all the time, it gets really muddy in the academic literature. So I don't want to get into some sort of deep dive into the framing literature and what the philosophy behind it and the different paradigms and what's it. But I do want to take a couple of seconds and let you know where I'm coming from on this. So the kind of framing research I do comes out of sociology. It's what we call the constructionist paradigm. So reality is on some level socially constructed. So we assume that frames are multiple. So when somebody, and I hear this in classes sometimes, the students are developing their senior seminar projects. People will ask a question, it's a reasonable question. How do media cover X? The answer to that is always, it's complicated. They cover it a lot of ways, or maybe a few different ways. So we assume frames are multiple. We also assume they're oppositional. So we can have conflicting frames that contradict each other, okay? They're negotiated through discourse. It's not as though, we've got these frames or these buckets that we put our stories in that don't change over time. Journalists are embedded in society. And so they get feedback from readers and audience members and bosses, and these frames change through time. And this is a part where I think it's actually important for me to study this stuff in my position here, because they're related to routine practices. So when I talk to my Journalism 307 students, which there are a wonderful number here today, when I'm teaching you routine practices, one of the things I'm doing is I'm teaching you how to frame stories. It's sort of inevitable. And I'm always asking myself, is there a way we could do this better? Okay. All right. I had a couple more quotes there, but I'm going to skip those. Unless, I guess we do want to hear. A quote that I always come back to in my research is Herbert Gans, another sociologist, talks about one of the important reasons for studying media content is to learn what society tells itself about itself through the news. And I think that's a cool idea, and it's a fun thing to do. So I promise you, I'm going to spend just a little more time on theory method stuff, but it's kind of important that we have the same vocabulary. When we talk about media frames, we talk about selection, we talk about emphasis. So we talk about problem definitions. How we define a problem is an important part of talking about the problem, and winning being able to define the problem is part of the way toward winning the framing war. If we define the problem on my terms, I've kind of won. Tied up with that is, what's the cause of the problem? How do we evaluate the problem from a moral perspective? And what are the solutions that we're interested in for this problem? So without getting into the geeky method stuff, what I do is I look for these different aspects separately, and then I do a statistical thing called a cluster analysis, and I look for patterns. I call those patterns frames. And I've found that moral evaluations have been neglected in previous research. So, one last little bit of theory. I've turned to this thing called moral foundations theory, which comes out of a field called evolutionary psychology, which I don't know why, but when I discovered that that was a thing, I thought that was pretty neat. But the idea behind moral foundations theory is that moral decision making is related to intuitions that are almost automatic. We make our moral decisions, boom, instantly. Moral reasoning is a bit slower, and it comes later. And it's based on a series of foundations, these things that exist in our brains called moral foundations. And we can think of them like, the metaphor that's often used is we can think of them like taste receptors. So the taste receptors, they're a thing we all have, and they're individually variable. At the same time, there's a cultural component too. So a person who grew up in Norway probably generally in the aggregate has a different set of taste preferences than somebody who grew up in Sri Lanka. Individual variation related to culture can be retrained, but so that's the metaphor as we talk about moral foundations. And these moral foundations, they're the building blocks for the moral stories we tell each other. There are 5 at the center of most moral foundations research. We have care and harm. These are presented on a continuum. So there's the positive and negative pole. Care relates to, we want to take care of helpless people or creatures. We want to protect babies and kittens. And so we get really mad with people who harm babies and kittens. There are other cute things out there, but babies and kittens are the cutest probably. Fairness and cheating, same kind of deal. Everybody wants a fair shake. We want to make sure nobody's getting away with something. So these 2 moral foundations are typically called individualizing foundations. They deal with the protection of individual rights. The other 3 we call binding foundations, and they're what bring us together as a group. So loyalty and betrayal. Think of your high school sports rivalry. You know, we're us and they're them. We like us and we protect us. And a part of that is creating a them that we don't like so much. A part of living together is dealing with a certain level of authority and submitting sometimes to authority, to your boss, or there's this kind of hierarchical thing. So that's the idea between authority and subversion. Sanctity and degradation is it's related to the human emotion of disgust, which again, as I started doing this research, I was fascinated to find out that's really unique to humans, the idea of disgust. So these are the moral foundations I'm going to talk about on some level. What MFT research, what moral foundations theory research has found is these are actually connected to ideology. Liberals generally, in the aggregate, tend to focus on, the individualizing foundations almost exclusively. Conservatives tend to rely on all 5 of them more equally, okay? What's great about MFT, actually, is they've been able to identify different moral patterns that are related to libertarianism or the religious left, you know, groups of people we don't really talk about that much. Okay, that's the theory stuff. Let's get to the meat of things. First study I want to talk about is related to a 2010 ballot initiative in Oklahoma. Right around 2010, we started seeing a rise in U.S. states it was a push to ban courts from using Islamic legal rulings in American jurisprudence. And it was usually couched in the idea of Sharia law. Sharia is a very interesting, very complex concept that I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about at the moment. Suffice it to say that the people who were pushing these Sharia bans were using a very narrow interpretation of what Sharia meant. And also, without taking too much of a political stance on this, a lot of the argument seemed to be it seemed to be a solution in search of a problem. There was, so far as I can tell, there's been one case in the U.S. where somebody relied on a Sharia concept in a legal ruling. That said, there was this movement that was springing up around 2010. Oklahoma was interesting because it was a ballot initiative. It mentions Sharia specifically. Some of these things talk about international law as sort of a way of not saying Sharia, kind of not violating the First Amendment. And it was a ballot measure. In a lot of states, these were legislative acts. There have been dozens and dozens of these. I've lost count at this point. So my colleague Jennifer and I, we examined letters to the editor in two Oklahoma newspapers during the heat of this debate. By the way, a postscript on this: the ballot initiative passed, so Sharia was prohibited from Oklahoma courts, but this was overturned on appeal to the federal courts as being unconstitutional. So we were really interested in trying out this moral foundations theory idea. So this was so far as I know, this was the first study that was published that used this technique. That sounds kind of braggy, doesn't it? I'm sorry. We were the first. Anyway, we found three frames in these letters to the editor. Two of them were very strongly oriented in favor of the amendment, so they were anti-Sharia letters. The first frame we named the Patriot frame, and you see under the moral evaluations column there were a variety of moral evaluations or moral foundations present in those letters. But doing some statistical stuff, we found there's a statistically significant emphasis on harm in these letters. And the harm that was described in these letters, it really did have to do with terrorism, and it had to do with fear of something bad happening. There's a quote that's a good illustration of this frame. It would be naive to believe that Muslims, even so-called moderates, only want to live in our country and be peaceable. That's what the Patriot frame was roughly all about. And so, of course, the treatment recommendation there was, we want to pass the amendment. There was another pro-amendment frame, which we named the Heritage frame. Talked about loyalty to the American way, and loyalty was the statistically significant emphasis in this frame. So again, they wanted to pass the amendment. And in this case, though, the arguments centered on the supremacy of American institutions. So they would mention the Founding Fathers, the Supreme Court, things like that. An illustration quote from this frame is, any judge who considers Sharia is violating the Constitution and should resign or be expelled from the bench. So finally, all of the anti-amendment letters ended up in one frame. We called this the Golden Rule frame. You notice nothing is underlined in red, for those of you who can see. I know everybody probably can't see the table here. There was a lot of moral language there, but nothing came out as being statistically significant, which means sort of the moral language was there, but it wasn't real hot-blooded. These were not very morally focused arguments. They were focused on other concepts, other ideas. But a quote that illustrates that would be, singling out one religious group, especially the least popular one, licenses discrimination against any group that becomes unpopular in the future. So this was the study we did on the Oklahoma Sharia debate. For those of you, again, who can see, here's just a little visualization. Up here in green, we have the anti-amendment letters, and there you can see, this is what this looks like, this kind of cluster analysis. The anti-amendment letters are off, kind of on their own. The pro-amendment letters, they're sort of mixed in together. One frame is kind of up near the top quadrant of that pile, but there's enough difference that it looks interesting, but you can also see that they're pretty similar on some levels. So it makes it interesting to try and interpret. Okay, so the next bit of research I want to talk about it relates to mosque construction controversies. So as I already talked about, the Muslim population generally is pretty small in the U.S., but it's growing quickly. And that means, logically, there are more Muslims who seek out a place to worship. So the number of mosques in the U.S. is really surging. It grew about 74% in the first decade of this century, and that number is continuing to climb. So there have been dozens of mosque projects that have been accompanied by some sort of controversy at the local approval level. We're talking the zoning board, the planning commission, this kind of thing. Sometimes these debates are like your standard planning commission debates, where it's like we talk about setbacks or building heights or water drainage, stuff that's not that exciting. But very often these debates were transformed, and they were turned into some way of relitigating the Islam's very legitimacy as a religion in the U.S. Is this should this faith be allowed into our neighborhoods? It's what these conversations turned into sometimes. So this was all happening as I'm really in the middle of my doctoral program. So this is a hot controversy, but it's still a hot controversy. So to do this work, and this is the basis of my dissertation. I've published one journal article out of this data, and I've just found out that another one has been accepted. So I've been really working on this a lot for these last few years. To tell you how I went about this, I looked at about 350 news stories from 5 newspapers in Atlanta, New York, Nashville, Temecula, California, Chicago. These were places that were picked, number one, for a bit of geographic diversity, but mainly because, so not all of these mosque controversies got much media coverage, but these are all places that did have controversies that got a lot of coverage. In New York, of course, is famous for the so-called Ground Zero Mosque, which dominated news coverage for several weeks in the summer of 2010. Temecula and Murfreesboro are others that received tons of coverage nationally. Okay, and so some variables. For problem definition, I'm looking at sources and I'm looking at topics. For causal attribution, there's 2 main arguments. On one side, you've got people who say Islam is not a religion, it's a dangerous political ideology that must be resisted. The other side of the debate, that's a weird binary framing, sorry, but this is what I'm coding for. There was a sense of, Muslims have a right to worship and should be, and we must extend that right to them. For moral evaluations, I used the moral foundations that I talked about a moment ago. And treatment recommendation was really the mosque should be stopped or the mosque should be allowed. Okay, so this is going to come up. I'm going to talk about 3 frames here. We found 5. I say we. That's this. In this case, it's the royal we. I did this. So the first frame I called the local regulation frame. These were meeting stories, basically. These were timely, hard news reports that were centered on events in the approval process, so a planning commission meeting. The local Islamic community members and government officials were the main sources. They didn't really talk about whether Islam was a political ideology or whether Muslims had a right to practice their faith. That wasn't present. The moral evaluations were very strongly clustered around loyalty and authority. And as far as build the mosque or don't build the mosque, that was not present, or both sides were kind of equally present. This is a really process-related frame. And it had this sense of clinical objectivity. And so, again, those of us in the journalism department, we talk about objectivity sometimes. It's like a professional norm, but it's super problematic. And so in this case, when I say it had a sense of objectivity, it was really clinical in that we're focused on numbers, we're focused on dates, we're trying to make sure all sides are equally portrayed, and so it feels like it's balanced. But what's interesting with that is even within this sense of objectivity, there are important questions raised. What defines a mosque? What goes on in a mosque? What defines a neighborhood? What should be allowed in our neighborhoods? These kinds of things. These questions are raised, but they're sort of left dangling. The next frame, it's similar in that there's not much in the way of causal attribution or treatment recommendation. You see both sides. And again, loyalty and authority these are the moral evaluations. But what we see with the political debate, there's a wide variety of topics. It's a wide variety of sources. What happens in this frame is we're talking about the debate itself. We're not talking about the bureaucratic processes. We're talking about a social debate. Let me give you an example from the Chicago Tribune. There's a quote that says, on the one side, the issue is about the right to have a sacred place where believers can pray. On the other, it is about preventing religious institutions from crowding residential neighborhoods. So beside the what's being said there, I want you to pay attention to the construction of that sentence, because in this frame you see that a lot. On the one side there's this, on the other side there's that, and then you have quotes from players on both sides of that debate. The other thing that made this very interesting, and why I named it the political debate frame, is this is where we saw a lot of 2010 midterm election stuff. And you saw people who were irrelevant to the local debates coming out and making statements. And in most cases, the position was more reliably predicted by whether they were facing a tough re-election or not. So for example, Harry Reid actually came out against the mosque in New York. He was a Democrat, and most Democrats were in favor because he was in the middle of a very tough re-election debate. And also, what does the senator from Nevada have to do with a mosque in New York? This is where you saw a lot of that happening. Finally, of these three, we see the legal authority frame. It's actually not that interesting of a frame, other than statistically, it was very unique. It stood out among itself. This is where all the court cases ended up. And and it was really strongly clustered around the moral evaluation of authority. And if you think about it, judges decide things, they reject rulings. It's very definitive, authoritative language. And that was reflected in this frame. And this did end up in some courts. So I want to pause for a second and talk a little bit more about how we define frames. So Shanto Iyengar, back in the 90s, came up with this idea of episodic and thematic frames. And an episodic frame, which is what a lot of our news coverage is, it tells stories as events that happen in time, sort of disassociated from any broader context. This is a meeting that happened, and this is the vote that was taken. This is what's happening right now. Iyengar called it a parade, only a parade, sorry, third time I got the quote right, only a passing parade of specific events that feature a context of no context. So the next two frames, though, that we're going to talk about, we call thematic frames. Thematic frames take the issue and they do place it strongly within a larger perspective. And these frames are really important because they influence audience perceptions and interpretations by giving the contextual clues we need about broader social causes and solutions to issues. And I also want to say, these frames are happening alongside. It's not like we'll have all the episodic frames and then we'll have a thematic frame. It's like a gumbo or something, or a nice chicken soup. I'm kind of hungry. I'm thinking of food metaphors. So let's talk about these two thematic frames that I found. The first was called the Muslim Neighbors frame. These were feature stories, featured Muslim community leaders as main sources. The moral evaluations were loyalty and authority, but there also was a sub-thread of harm in there. And the harm here being, we are being oppressed. We're being denied the opportunity to practice our religion. Strongly clustered on the idea that the mosque in question should move forward. What was interesting about this frame is we saw a lot of feature stories that it was like a particular genre, where we're going to go visit the mosque. Maybe it's an open house, or maybe it's Ramadan or something like that, and we're going to describe what happens there. And what was interesting about these is very often the reporters tried to make mosque activities seem indistinguishable from what would happen in a mainline Protestant church. So there'd be a description of a little girl in the corner playing with her Barbie doll, or some kind of food-related thing happening after a service, or description of Sunday school activities or whatever. And the idea there, while it seemed clearly to have benign intentions, the idea, the result was you really erased what was distinctively Muslim about these communities. And it created this situation where Muslims' right to worship became contingent on their practices becoming intelligible to non-Muslims. So it's just kind of a weird thing. And finally, the smallest frame, but the one that probably merits a decent amount of attention is what we call the Islamic threat frame. And that's kind of, an example of that is the phrase, "they don't want to be us." These were feature stories, opponent protests. The top sources were anti-mosque activists. The main moral evaluations were loyalty and authority, but there was also harm, but also betrayal. And betrayal is really, that centers on threats to the in-group. So there's an outside group that we're trying to oppose here. So this frame had a strong sense that Islam is an incompatible political system that poses some kind of inherent danger, and that the threat must be stopped. by regulation. So what does this all mean? I sliced this up in some interesting ways, but so in terms of moral evaluations, all of these emphasized loyalty to the in-group and deference to the hierarchical authority that maintains in-group dominance. Occasionally, mosque opponents were portrayed as being out-group for denying people the right to practice their faith, which is sometimes portrayed as a violation of American values, but more often, Muslims were placed in this out-group position. Routine news processes for covering municipal bureaucracy and legal proceedings really shaped the discourse, as did the journalistic convention of objectivity, so this is sort of both sides of an issue question. Reflecting those routines, journalists really favored sources with official titles, timed their stories to coincide with milestones in the bureaucratic process. Stories were really bureaucratically driven. Finally, these last two frames, the Muslim neighbors and Islamic threat, really set up a good Muslim, bad Muslim dichotomy. Whereas no matter how the reporter seems to feel about the Muslim they're talking to or the community they're talking about, what first happens is we set them up as an outsider, and then we evaluate them as being politically good or bad. That was a pervasive part of these frames. This is sort of problematic, sort of. Very. Okay, so the last little bit, I'm just going to jam through this in a couple of minutes. This is brand spanking new research. I will tell you, I did the last copy edits on this journal submission this morning, so it has not yet been submitted. So you are the first people I've talked to about this. Yeah, so I'm just gonna give a real brief overview. But again, my colleague Jennifer Howie and I, we were really fascinated by this debate about radical Islam and is it a term when there's a terrorist attack? Should we say radical Islam or should we not? And the debate got really weird. And so we wanted to delve into this a little bit. So here's a tweet from President Trump back during the campaign. And this was the debate. Kept on coming up. Is President Obama finally going to mention the words radical Islamic terrorism? If he doesn't, he should immediately resign in disgrace. So there's this debate over the contested term. I was just critiquing this in the news stories. But on the one side, you've got people who say it's important to identify the phenomenon of radical Islam, that it's a thing, and not talking about it is in some way being in denial about it. The other side of this debate typically says it's really important not to paint all Muslims with a broad brush. Okay? So we did two studies in this article. Which was fancy of us, you got to admit. The first, we did a content analysis. We looked at the New York Times and the Washington Post, and we looked at all occurrences of the term radical Islam. And what we found, the first time it was used was in 1981. We found about 1,000 stories, and we went from 1981 through the middle of 2016. The content analysis, it's not actually the most impressive content analysis. We didn't do a lot of statistics with it because it told sort of a face level story that was pretty interesting. And that, a couple of the things that leapt out at us, the use of the term is increasing rapidly. So the median year of these uses was 2010. So out of 35 years, 7 years ago, it was 6 years ago, 6 years previously, was the median, knowing that our sample ended in 2016. Again, for Journalism 307 students, we were just talking about how to calculate a median. It's the number right in the middle. So half of the stories have happened in the last 5 years, 6 years. 16.7% were published in 15 alone. Of these occurrences, they're mostly undefined, which means this is a term that's just out there, but there's not a real, we don't actually know what it means. There's this assumption that the audience is going to come to the table with the tools to interpret what radical Islam means. The other thing that was interesting, we measured, we did some computer-assisted text analysis, and we looked at emotional content. The stories became much more emotionally charged over time, almost exclusively negatively. These were negative emotions. So the stories in 1981, the early 90s, they were pretty emotionally muted. As time goes on, they get more emotionally charged, and these emotions are very negative. They also grow increasingly concerned with domestic U.S. issues. When the term began, we talk about internal political squabbles in Libya or Egypt. As time goes on, it becomes almost exclusively about the U.S. or Western powers and our response to terrorism. And that's the other point that we found, was it was becoming more increasingly connected to terrorism. In the earlier stories, it was easy to find stories that talked about radical Islam that did not talk about terrorism. But as time has gone on, these two terms have become a little bit more conflated. So that's what we found in the content analysis. We also did an experiment. This is the first one I've ever done. It was exciting. We had a group of participants. We had about 305, and they were assigned to two conditions, one of two conditions. They would read a simulated news article, and one talked about attributed an attack to terrorism, another attributed an attack to radical Islam. And what we found was that reading about an attack attributed to radical Islam increased a general sense of fear of Muslims. We were using something called, it was an Islamophobia scale. So this was one measure of Islamophobia. And we did find a statistically significant increase in this general fear of Muslims and Islam level. The other thing we found that was really sort of fascinating was that political liberals tended to differentiate strongly between these two concepts, and conservatives didn't. Not exactly sure the implications of that. But that was our finding there. Wow. I've talked really fast. What does it all mean? I'm actually interested to hear what some of you all think what some of this means, or to hear what some of your questions are. As I start making sense of it, and especially as I start thinking about connecting this to my teaching and also to the journalism that I do, language matters. It's very interesting to me how much we emphasized, at least in these stories, loyalty and authority. It's as though there are no other moral evaluations. And what would a news story look like if we emphasized sanctity? Why does that never come up? It's interesting to me. On the final study, it's just interesting to me, I think, and important to be mindful of the terms that we're using. Radical Islam is one. It's a pretty recent addition to the lexicon. It seems to get sort of thrown around a lot. It might be important to be mindful about how we use terms. What's probably more problematic and a more pressing concern, I think, to me, is Muslim Americans are talked about more than they're listened to in our media discourse. We tend to reach out to Muslims in a small number of stories. When there's a terrorist attack, asking for condemnation. When their mosque has been vandalized. Occasionally when it's Ramadan. And that's mostly it. We tend not to be very creative about figuring out other stories to tell. And I think that's that's on us as journalists to get better in that respect. And the last thing that I think is really important is that our coverage tends to reinforce this outgroup status, and even positive coverage, so-called positive coverage, perpetuates this good Muslim, bad Muslim dichotomy. So, wow, I timed that like perfectly to hit 10-2. So that's what I've got. I'm eager to hear your questions, and there's somebody with a microphone out there who's going to do the Phil Donahue routine. That's a reference that I don't know if a lot of you will get. Yeah. Oh, thank you. Okay, there's the person with the mic. Did I answer all the questions? Oh, there's one way in the back.
So I actually have a question about the condemnations. Why do we see asking for condemnations almost exclusively from Muslims and not from Christians? That might be outside of the scope of your research, but why don't we see asking for condemnation of attacks by Christian terrorists from archbishops?
Right. Well, I really do attribute that to a lack of cultural literacy, a lack of cultural understanding among some of the journalists, in our newsrooms, really. The idea that something bad happening in the world, that religion is the defining thing, irrespective of sect, ethnicity, country of origin, anything like that. So you may have and you see this. You'll see some kind of horrible event that happens in. This happened a lot during the Iraq War, where something bad will happen, and you've got Iraqi, Sunni perpetrators, and you'll have some sort of South Asian community, and people it's like you're being asked for comment, and it's like there's just one little thing that unites us, and there's a bunch of stuff that makes us different, and so it's a real kind of myopia. And I think it's something that we need to get better on, and it's something when I see it happen, I tend to try to push back. You're starting actually to see some pushback among some Muslim civil rights groups too. It's like, okay, come on, stop. Like this might have been fine 15 years ago, but we're really getting sick of the question. We've condemned and we've deplored and we've condemned and condemned and condemned, and no matter how much we condemn, you don't listen. So there's starting to be this sort of pushback too. So yeah, that's my short answer to that. There's one back there.
Hi, I was just wondering, after your experiment, you said that you did a scale of Islamophobia. What was the questions that you asked to be able to determine whether they were Islamophobic or not?
That's a good question. I have the paper over in the corner there. I don't remember the scale. What we found was we did the classic scholar thing. We found somebody else's Islamophobia scale and we cited it. So I can't remember the items, but they seemed plausible. It had to do with it was a lot of things about fear and there were several. I'm sorry. There were several subscales to that. But when we're done talking, I'm happy to show you the scale.
Thank you. I was just wondering, I hear a lot of things about, or I've seen articles and I've heard talk about how Muslims in this country and in Europe particularly, that Muslims are failing to integrate into society, with the implication of integrating meaning Muslims are being identical to the general Christian population or whatever. So I'm just wondering if there was any sort of discussion about the wording for integration versus other words about that might be involved in being part of a society without having to give up cultural values and customs, etc.
Right,
Thank you.
right. That's a fascinating question, and we did not look at any of that specifically, but you're giving me an idea. That might be the next thing. And as far as that discourse goes, I'm not a big fan of it because I think, I come from a strong punk rock background where we should be free to be what we want to be, and I've got a pretty wide-ranging view of what integration means. So, but thank you for that question. It's great. Sandra had a question up here.
I was wondering, Ryan, in your research, which I thought really, the timing couldn't be better, if you looked at the images too that accompany the text, because you started out with the images, and do these images support your findings in a certain way, or do they deconstruct your outcomes, or
That's
talk a little bit about that?
So the question here is whether I've looked at images in my research, and the answer to that question, I'm going to answer it in one way, really frankly. Up to this point, I haven't done visual framing. I've only done text, and I'll give you the answer that I don't put in my articles, because doing content analysis of text is a lot easier than doing content analysis of images. But you know what? That's a real problem in framing research, because you look at a picture and boom, you have an interpretation right away. So I'm very excited because my colleague in the journalism department, Joe Gosen, and I, along with a scholar from Arizona named Shahira Fahmy, we're in sort of the end stages of doing a visual framing study of the burkini debate that came up over this summer. I don't really know what our results are yet, but we've got all the coding done. Because it's a problem, and now I'm at the stage where it's like, okay, we've looked at the New York Times enough. Let's start looking at some pictures. Thanks. Caleb over here has one.
So you presented a lot of the ways that the media frames Islam, and the ways that we have that conversation in the media. How much do you think this is the media kind of dictating, and I'm using the media as a very, very
Sure.
wide term. How much do you think that is the media dictating the framing, and how much of it is the media using a framing that's already been presented by society as kind of a whole, or American society as a whole?
I think it's really strongly the latter, that we have these sort of prefab frames that we're used to, and we kind of shove any Muslim story. They go into, I'll switch from frames to buckets. We've got 3 or 4 Muslim buckets, and it's like, if it's a Muslim thing, we put it in that bucket or that bucket. There's some pretty strong research coming out of Australia. These folks had a grant to improve journalism education on this topic. This guy Mark Pearson, who I got to meet this summer, led this project, and that they did interviews with journalists responsible for covering for some of these stories in Australia. And what they found was the journalists themselves, they knew the coverage was shallow and kind of weirdly decontextualized, and they actually longed for better tools and more understanding and more knowledge. So I think there's beginning to be a sense that we could do our jobs better. But another thing to remember is journalists are part of the same culture. We're only a journalist part of the time, and so we're in the same soup. So, but that's a great question. Yeah, there's a couple over there. Yep.
How would you contrast how Muslim terrorist attacks are covered in the media versus like Christian terrorist attacks? carried out by white people.
Yeah, right.
Because I feel like they're a lot more emphasized and a lot more than like white Christian terrorist attacks.
Yeah. So, there's an interesting, I don't want to get out of my depth there answering your question. It's not that I'm trying to avoid it. I'm not exactly sure. And my research actually, for the most part, doesn't directly look at terrorism. And I do that on purpose because I think on some levels there's enough stuff about Muslims and terrorism kind of out there. So I don't do that work myself. My gut tells me that we have instances of mass violence that are perpetrated by somebody who's not a Muslim, and we typically don't know anything about their religious background. It's just not part of the reporting, and I think it would probably be, except for maybe the case of an organization like the Klan, in a lot of cases, it would probably be just as wrong to talk about Christian terrorist attacks as it would be to talk about Muslim terrorist attacks, because it's very often, we're talking about the works of fringe groups or deranged individuals. But it's a very astute question. It's just not part of the conversation. So, a couple questions back there. Oh, there we go.
You said the term radical Islam originated in about 1980 or so. Could you speak to when or why exactly the framing between who uses the term and whether or not we acknowledge it became so different?
Right. And this term may have been used before that, but this is the first time it came up in either the New York Times or the Washington Post was 81. So 2010 is the median, and so we start seeing this big uptick in the stories. You start seeing the rise of ISIS or Daesh, Islamic State, whatever name you want to call them. You start seeing that is one thing. Beyond that, I'm not exactly sure what the what the exacerbating event was, or if there was an event. You do tend to see, I think there is a connection between the move to ban Sharia in American jurisprudence, the rise in opposition to mosque construction, and this real focus on the concept of radical Islam as a specific thing. It all really starts happening around 2010. And there's some interesting work. This guy, Wajahat Ali, did a big report called the Islamophobia Network. And there are some folks out there who seem to be pushing this discourse in that direction. And so I guess right around 2010, you start seeing this just really concerted effort to brand Islam as a force that's incompatible with American life. So that's as best I can figure it out. But I love that question, and I'm gonna have to do some more thinking about that, because really I had never put those events together. But all this stuff really starts happening in 2010.
So can everyone hear me? Yeah. So I see where you were going with your research and where it led. And what I mainly was intrigued about was, while there was a variable amount of research that illustrated very distinctive sightings and narrow mind, I was also illustrating when you talked earlier, when you illustrated the not hot-blooded illustration or the golden rule frame, and it was interesting to me because of the uncertainty of it, because when it came to something of a support, it was very mixed route, whereas when you're really against something, you're more very it's more very focused, but in the sense of a narrow-minded. So into that case, where do you see is you see as like appropriate acknowledgement to defend one's side without becoming too narrow-minded?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure if I have a good answer to that. You know, I will couch this a little bit by saying, you know, so you're talking about the Oklahoma debate. What we're talking about there is, you know, this was a pretty small sample to begin with, and we're talking about 30%. So the other two frames comprised 70% of the debate, and these were so. There wasn't a lot of room for variance, you know what I mean? And so it before we get too definitive about this could have just been a research flaw.
Yeah, but I guess when you look towards later, grants, I was thinking more of the grandness of it when you get more into the oppositionals that are very concrete, and so forth with the neg, and when it comes then to when it comes to the dichotomy of it.
Yep. I see what you're saying. I think there's some interesting work by a guy named George Lakoff that operates in that space and really probes this question. We really are living in this time where people we disagree with politically, we don't just think they're wrong. We tend to think they're evil. And that's probably not good for us. And definitely this moral language piece plays a role in that. But I'll be frank with you that I'm still studying this. I don't know exactly how to you know, where this you know, where the end game is. So.
Yeah, I mean, as myself, I'm not really sure what the end game is either, but it's always good to illustrate another piece into the path that leads to the end game.
Yep, absolutely. So, there's a couple more. There's one back there and one back there.
Well, you brought up evil, so I wanted to ask you about Bannon, the chief strategist, who's formerly the CEO of Breitbart, and which is a conservative media outlet. I just wanted your thoughts on that and what you think about how that's going to move forward as that becomes kind of more influential.
If I'm going to be just like ultra super diplomatic, I'll say I'm probably going to have stuff to study for a long time. You know, I don't. This is probably getting more into my own personal political thoughts rather than my scholarships. I think I'm gonna be safe and pass. But if you want to meet me for coffee sometime, I'll talk your ear off. There's somebody back there.
Do you have a suggested call to action or solutions that you would propose could be implemented for media to better cover Muslim relations and in general for the public to become more aware of this issue?
Absolutely.
Issue,
and
but
yeah.
subject as a whole.
And in fact, Kim, remind me, and on the Cedar page, let's post some of these links I'm about to talk about. There's going to be a page in our institutional repository with the video of this talk, so you can relive these magic moments over and over again. And we'll put some links to some other resources. Poynter Institute runs a thing called NewsU, and there's a module on there that was done by Lawrence Pintack, who's the former dean of the Murrow School at Wazoo, called Reporting on Islam. It's a free module. It takes you through some basic educational things. There's a project I worked on at Michigan State. There's actually a couple. but there's a book called 101 Questions About, or 100 Questions and Answers About Muslim Americans. That's part of their Bias Busters guide series, which is a really cool project. And then there's this stuff I was talking about in Australia that was led by Mark Pearson. So you've got some folks out there in this space that are trying to provide materials for journalists to do this work better, because I think there's a real call for it. So, and also you can try to take my media and religion honors seminar next quarter.
Yeah, you spoke about Islamic threat frame.
Yeah.
Did you do a study that analyzes the lack of knowledge versus the people who was knowledgeable and still put out degrading rhetoric toward Islam?
I didn't. That would be fascinating to do. A step where I would go back, look at these stories, analyze them, and then go back and talk to the reporters who did the coverage and to figure out where they're coming from. And so no, I'm sorry, I didn't do that, but that's a great question.
Thanks again. This one's really quick. I mean, I don't know for you, but I was wondering if you had analyzed or found any notable observations about the difference between how Muslim men and Muslim women are portrayed in the media.
No, it's funny. I did one study where I was coding for a bunch of things. It was one of the very first ones I ever did, so frankly, it was sort of ham-fisted. It was not a very good. It's been published. I mean, so I don't want to speak too ill of it. I would do everything about it differently now. And my sample was pretty weird because gender issues never came up, which made me wonder. I probably did something wrong because that is a very controversial issue, and it's something that comes up a lot in the discourse. The burkini debate, I think, is going to be that study coming up is going to touch on some of these issues a little bit. But the other thing that I'll say is there is actually quite a bit of framing research in this space now. I'm sort of joined by a lot of other folks, and I think that work has been done by some folks, just not me specifically. All right. Any other hands or going once? Are we?
So then going back to the moral foundation, your moral foundations theory, little cat got my tongue, I guess. Let's see. Don't worry, I lost it. Sorry
Okay.
about that.
Cool. Well, it seems like we've gotten through all of it. Okay. Thank you so much, everybody. These are great questions. I will applaud you.